Welcome to the Pop Cult Podcast. Here are your hosts, Ariana and Seth.
This is the Pop Cult Podcast. I'm Seth.
I'm Ariana.
And after 1 week off, we're back.
We're back.
We decided to take a week off. I was coming off of an acid trip. Yeah, where I experienced ego death, which was a pretty intense experience. And also, we were kind of in this weird week where we're waiting for like some really good movies to come out at the end of the year, and I couldn't get access to some of the movies I wanted to watch. So it just felt like we were kind of forcing an episode, essentially.
Yeah, and we would probably end up talking about shows that we want to wait until later on to discuss.
That'll be more part of our end of the year thing. Yeah. So we are back because there were two films that dropped recently that are going to probably be on many critics' best of the year lists. And so we're going to talk about our thoughts on them. One of those is Alexander Payne's The Holdovers, which we'll talk about in the second half of the episode. But first, we're going to discuss Todd Haynes' May December. So it's a Haynes Payne episode.
Haynes and Paynes.
Which sounds like a TBS detective show.
Yeah.
So May December, the official description goes as follows. 20 years after their notorious tabloid romance, a married couple buckle under the pressure when a Hollywood actress meets them to do research for a film about their past. The film is very obviously based on the Mary Kay Letourneau, I think was her name, and Villy Falau was the name of the boy. Mary Kay Letourneau was a middle school teacher, I think in like Oregon or Washington State.
Yeah.
And she had an affair with one of her 7th grade students and became impregnated by him. And apparently they're still together.
She's dead.
Oh, yeah, she died. That's right.
She did.
But I think they were married up to her death.
Yep.
And then had not just the first child, but had other children after that. It was very weird.
Yeah, I think she got pregnant by him like twice.
Yeah.
And
I think they did have twins the second time, which that's reflected in this movie. So this uses that as its basis. It definitely references a lot of real life aspects of that case, but it is certainly its own thing. This is not like a true crime movie. It's something else entirely. So Ariana, before we talk about May, December, let's talk about just Todd Haynes' filmography in general. Of his movies, I know you've watched with me Poison, which was his anthology film with the short films, all centered around like AIDS and queerness.
Yes.
Safe, which also featured Julianne Moore.
Yes.
We saw Velvet Goldmine. We saw Far From Heaven. We've seen Carol.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's anything else I forgot that we've seen, but we've seen quite a few of his movies.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to know, just in general, what do you think of Todd Haynes as a filmmaker?
I think he's a filmmaker that he deserves a lot more praise than he's received. A lot of times what happens with Todd Haynes, at least for me, is I will think to myself, he's probably one of my favorite directors. But I always have to like kickstart my memory to be like, oh, what did he do? Because it's just like he has one of those names that isn't like can fade into the background. He does take a lot of time between films, and I don't see. I mean, at the least for us, we don't really watch like a lot of interviews with him.
Yeah, I find he doesn't have he's not one of those filmmakers with a very distinct style like a Wes Anderson.
Yeah,
all of his movies are stylized. But it almost feels like his style is something I don't quite have a word to describe it, or he kind of changes style based on the script that he's given.
Yeah, so it feels more like he has a chameleon kind of sense about him, but
he's not like one of those journeyman directors that like studios love, where just a guy who'll make a movie. It still makes it to how he wants to make it.
He always goes with topics that are interesting to him. You don't get into this film where you're kind of like, oh, he just did it in order. Like, oh, this was a movie film. This was in order to make sure that his next film will be his passion project.
Nothing feels like a compromise.
No, it doesn't feel like a compromise. So this film has a lot in relation to Far From Heaven, but it feels, I mean, style-wise. Why also
it's referencing kind of like female-centric melodramas.
Yes.
Which I thought this kind of felt like a Lifetime movie.
Yes, that's what we were talking about. Like during it, it felt like there was a cheapness to it, but it was on purpose that still looked amazing.
Yeah, it was never like cheap enough that you were kind of like, oh, this is like a low budget movie. There was like a sinister edge to the movie that you don't get with a Lifetime movie. And I also felt like it was sleazy, but it also felt like mature. It wasn't bringing up these like controversial topics to titillate the audience. It was bringing them up and exploring them because Todd Haynes genuinely wanted to understand like the mind of someone that could do something like this.
Yeah, and it's also just, it's a condemnation of sorts, even though he is extracting so much influence by this past case that we mentioned. There's also this underlying story where it's sort of like, who are we to invade these people's lives in order to get a thrill out of it?
Well, I would call it's a film of a clash of two predators.
Yes.
Gracie, played by Julianne Moore, the Mary Kay Letourneau stand-in, is a very obvious predator based on why she's known.
Yeah.
But however, Natalie Portman's character, the actress Elizabeth, is also a predator, but a different kind. She's more like a scavenger in that she's coming in and picking the bones of this very dysfunctional, very fucked up family for no reason to help them, but to help herself.
Yes.
And so in that way, Haynes is showing there's a lot of parallels between these two women. And it's great because so often in American cinema frames like, well, movies that center on women should always show women as positive, heroic protagonists. And yeah, those movies exist. But I think for actors, the roles that are more interesting, and the film kind of even says that, are these more fucked up roles.
Yeah.
And this is a movie where you get two great female actresses really taking on roles that are problematic.
Yes.
And doing amazing things with them and making them very interesting and never dulling the edges of their characters and making us constantly uncomfortable. Like almost every scene, there's something uncomfortable about it. But there is one performance I think was the breakout. Of course, everybody knows Natalie Portman and Julianne Moore. They're great performances. I would say I think Portman compared to Moore has more inconsistency in her performances. You were saying the other day that Portman is very dependent on who's directing her.
Yes.
While Moore, you can kind of put her in any movie, not every movie, but she's pretty, whatever you put her in, she's going to do a pretty good job.
I think she has even said that it depends on the director for her, but Todd Haynes and her already have an established relationship. So there are times in the way that she moved her mouth that I was like, my memory jogging back to like the Scandal was exactly the way that woman moved her mouth, but it was on selective times when she would do this baby voice.
She has like a lisp, the character of Gracie, but it's not done in a way that feels exaggerated or cartoonish. It feels like, oh yeah, when people have a lisp and maybe they've had some like speech therapy, it never fully goes away. If you're paying close attention to them speaking, you'll pick up on, oh, there's like a little bit of a speech impediment.
And also she manipulates it at time when necessary in order to make herself more girlish.
Or naive. We're going to talk about that, how naivete is a big theme throughout this movie. And I feel like Portman, I hope she does more work with Todd Haynes because she did so well in this movie, and she's an actress who is very hit and miss for me.
Yes.
Sometimes it feels like she's phoning it in some movies, and then other times she's just like absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, and I think it also just shows that she does the films that are needed to get done in order to be focused on the smaller projects, because she has mentioned that before. For example, she left Marvels for a while because Marvel Cinematic Universe, because she was like, I don't like the direction where my character's going. And she came back, but even
for one of the worst Marvel movies we've ever got.
It wasn't her fault.
No,
she was fine.
She was fine.
But when she has a director that has a clear vision, it's lock and step. When the director does not have a clear vision, you're just kind of like, why are you here? Why are the fuck you here?
But the breakout performance of this movie, so it's the actor that you're going in, you probably won't know much about. At least that was true for me. Charles Melton as Joe, who is the Vili Falau stand-in.
Yes, he
heartbreaking performance.
Yeah, okay, so you don't know much about him as
I know.
I do.
I think I know he played Moose in Riverdale.
Okay, yeah,
but I've never even seen a clip of it.
The thing is, a lot of people like to compare him to Handsome Squidward, like the meme, because of his face.
Very strong jaw.
Most of the time, it's he's a 6-pack, really like,
and he had a dad bod in this movie.
yeah, and I really love the fact that he just had a dad bod, but he was still attractive.
There's this, well, the character of Joe, who he plays, is this like roiling mass of contradictions. He has a dad bod, but he's clearly emotionally not an adult.
Oh no,
there's something wrong inside very badly.
And
that his own children seem more mature than him near the end of the movie.
Yeah, and it's the sadness about it because their kids don't want to like talk or admit why it is that their father is the way he is.
Well, it's like the psychological horror of coming to terms with the nature of their parentage is so awful that like I would not blame them.
Yeah, and I think it's also like it would make sense even if like the genders were reversed, right?
Yeah.
It's become so normalized, like
have a much older father and a much younger mother. Yeah.
And it's become normalized like way in the past that no, I met your mom when she was 14. And like when she's 18, we got married.
Really? You waited? You waited? Yeah.
And it's like it is something that it's like it does feel like a Lifetime film in where you find out that they made the story like the based on this story,
because there's a film within the film that is like the sleazy adaptation. Yes. Yeah,
and it's supposed to be Natalie Portman's character is not like this A-list actress. She is on TV a show. She's a TV actress who's on Nora's Ark.
It's like a show about a vet.
Yes,
so like a medical procedural show. Yes. Yeah,
and she's doing a like made for TV, but a little bit more heightened film about what had happened, even though like there had been past
like an HBO original kind of thing, where it's like it's that little bit of higher budget, so it's supposed to be classier.
Yes,
but still exploitative.
Yeah, and so she goes to meet up with them. I do like the fact that we do start with her just having a normal conversation with her fiance on the phone.
Yeah, she doesn't really have any direct human connections in the film. It's always over the phone.
Yeah.
So she imposes herself in this family and forces a connection with them.
Yes.
But then anybody she knows outside in her normal life,
you don't see her physically.
They're far away from her.
Yeah. And I think it's this clever device of showing on how she keeps people at a distance when it comes to her true persona. And she will not let that be revealed. And then like there comes a point in the movie that like Gracie, played by Moore, kind of like vanishes in the background a little bit until she's back in the forefront.
Well, because it's clear that Elizabeth is the main character of the film, the actress. Yeah.
And Elizabeth, for example, like does this whole thing. She goes to the twins' school and like
she addresses like a drama class.
Where one of the twins is there to talk about wanting to be in complicated. But it's also like,
well, there's a question about sex scenes in movies.
Yes.
And she like almost stares down. It's Mary, who's the youngest daughter of Joe and Gracie.
I think it's not staring down. She's just talking about
it. But there's these moments where she like glances at her while she's talking about it. And there's this implication, like a subtext, that they both have an understanding that when they're talking about sex scenes, they're both thinking about the sex scenes that Elizabeth will be doing in the movie about her mother and her father.
Yeah. And it's like, it's also she does it in a way that isn't too explicit, but it's also enough to make everybody a little bit uncomfortable. Like she pushes it to the edge where it's not pornographic, but you're just like, she is talking about lust and want that makes the teenager still, because it's coming out from like an adult's mouth.
And then that scene, I feel like it pairs with the scene where Elizabeth goes to the pet shop, which in this version of events, Gracie was not Joe's teacher.
Yeah.
She worked at a pet store, and Joe was like a teenage employee, I think over the summer or something.
Like had applied for a job, but through her.
But she had known of him because they were in the same community.
Yes.
And so the scene where Elizabeth has the manager of the pet store take her back to where this couple were caught having statutory rape, essentially that Gracie was committing statutory rape. And then when he leaves, how Elizabeth like writhes on the stairs where they were caught, psychologically like recreating in her head the moment there. But then her face is so disturbing because she has so much glee and like pleasure from fantasizing this moment in her head. And I felt like that was the moment where the film was kind of revealing to us there's something wrong with Elizabeth too. She is not a good person.
Yeah, she's manipulating the situation in order to get into the character's head, but it's not at a point of being like questioning what are like where's the gray area. Instead, she's kind of viewing that like Gracie like was like basically in charge of the whole thing, which essentially she is. But it's also like viewing herself as a possibility of taking Gracie's place entirely.
Well, because she starts sneaking around with Joe, or she goes to visit Joe at his work because he's an X-ray technician, I think.
Yes.
And there's the comment she makes because she never tells Gracie that she was going to go see Joe at his work, and makes that comment of, "Oh, I know what it must be like to sneak around
with
you now."
And
oh, I probably shouldn't have said that. And
and then she goes like, "Promise not to tell anybody."
And it's this thing of where she is making Joe relive the kind of psychological manipulation that Gracie did to him, because Elizabeth doesn't view these as people. She views them as specimens to be studied.
Yes.
Like you might observe an animal or something. And so she has no empathy for them, which is horrific. And it's just simply about, oh, I want to see how he reacts when I say something to help inform the performance I'm going to make so I can get accolades and applause for what I do.
Yeah.
Not understanding, because she never sees it for herself, the way Joe just like spirals for the rest of the movie and becomes like a child by the end of it again, where he's like whimpering and sobbing and being very submissive in a very disturbing way to Gracie.
Yes.
What did you think of the roof scene between Joe and his son Peter?
That was so heartbreaking. And I think like I loved the dialogue because it just felt so earnest, and the way that he did it was just, I think it was great because I think it's also, this is an actor who normally plays the age of
a
his
teenager,
son, a teenager, right? So there is something that felt very organic when he was like, "Oh, I've never done weed," like, and his son's like, are you kidding me that you've never done weed?" Kind of like perplexed about it.
Because he sees Joe as his dad.
Yeah.
But without comprehending, well, my dad is what, like 16 years older than me? Because they would have been the kids that they had when she got out of prison. So he was maybe like 18 years old.
Like 17 or 18.
Yeah. Like he's not much older than him.
Yeah.
And it's that moment where Joe kind of makes that connection of, oh, my dad's a child.
Yeah, in comparison to like everyone else's parents. And it's like this sadness when Joe's like, "I don't know if we're making a connection."
I pulled that quote. It said, "I can't tell if we're connecting or if I'm creating a bad memory for you."
And like it's heartbreaking because it's said to the point of like that it just feels so vulnerable and so true of just being like, "I want to connect with you, but I don't know if I'm traumatizing you now."
And it is also a reflection that Joe is emotionally immature, so he can't gauge what's an appropriate interaction with his son or not. Also, the fact that he was like groomed and raped by this woman, he's now married to her. This is a whole minefield of not understanding what's appropriate and inappropriate.
Yeah, and it's also like, it's not just the appropriate or inappropriate. He is the main parent that is the most concerned about their kids.
That is, yeah. Gracie feels very disconnected from because she has two older children from her first marriage that are estranged.
Yeah.
And then her children with Joe, we don't see a lot of interaction.
We say that they're estranged, but she says that they talk to them on a day-to-day basis.
But when you see the way the movie plays out, they're clearly estranged.
Because like towards the end, like she reveals something like to Elizabeth that was a conversation between her oldest son and her, and she's like, "How do you know that?" And she's like, "I told you, I talk to him every day."
Oh, that is true. Yeah. So well, let's go back to Gracie, because I think Gracie is probably, I'm still not sure which I think is more interesting, Elizabeth or Gracie. They're both very fascinating characters to like analyze.
Yeah.
But there's a quote I pulled from Gracie that I think informs a lot of her mind, which is, "I am naive. I always have been. In a way, it's been a gift." that it's been a gift, because Gracie turns on and off her naivete when it is convenient for her in the situation.
Yeah.
And especially the very ending scene between Elizabeth and Gracie, we suddenly see Gracie as not a naive person. She's a vicious person.
Yeah, she just manipulates the situation. It's sort of like, it is these undertones of things that we see in normally like in Lifetime movies or in like soap operas. It's the emotional manipulation that a lot of times we're like, oh, it's not equivalent to how men speak. But it's also this understanding that she uses it like a tool very carefully, and also ensuring that nobody else knows what she's doing, but also just being like the example that I have is just like when Elizabeth goes and interviews with like Gracie's lawyer. And he's like, I could see the resemblance between you two. You look like you could never harm a thing in your life. And how he was like, no, she's very naive. She thought that this is like, and so it's like, she's even fucking convinced him.
Well, it's Gracie is an actor. She just doesn't perform in movies.
No,
she's an actor in her own life.
Yeah.
That no one really knows the real Gracie, or those that do have been like groomed or intimidated into silence. You think about the interview she does, I think it's like a neighbor, the woman with the glasses near the beginning who's at the cookout, because Gracie mentioned something about, oh, the people in our community love us in this suburb.
Yeah.
And even the neighbor doesn't want this movie to be made.
So she's like, things have finally settled down, and like, and it's because like she has an empty nest now, and so Gracie always tells her what to do.
Well, and I think one of the big themes of the movie is showing how evil can be normalized because it's too disgusting to want to grapple with. It's like the real life situation between Mary Kay Letourneau and Billy Falau, or any adult child sexual relationship, is so abhorrent that there's a natural inclination to want to look away and get away from it. But we can't understand it unless we look close at it. And looking close at it doesn't mean you're going to empathize with the predator. You need to understand what they're doing so you can prevent similar things in the future.
It's also like the fact that there is a lack of talk about sexuality. And it's about the fact that like even there's so many complications of when someone decides to become a predator, but also those who are are basically the victims. There is, because the one film that I thought I was thinking about, which one was it that we watched recently? It was like he becomes a sex worker after he'd been abused, and then he meets another kid who had blacked out everything.
Oh, Mysterious Skin, Gregor Rocky's film.
When we think about
Gregor Rocky and Todd Haynes, that would be a good pairing. Yeah,
we taught like how one kid completely blocks out everything and is convinced he's been abducted by aliens to explain why. He
creates a lie that's more comforting than the truth.
And then the other kid also doesn't want to demonize this person because he like explored bodily pleasure.
Because that's Joseph Gordon-Levitt's character, because he's queer, vilifying one of the only other queer people he's ever met in his life as a child feels complicated.
Yeah, and so
not realizing the man wasn't queer in that way, he was a child sexual predator.
Yeah, and it's like it's that complication of it. Like there's this whole thing that like so Gracie and Elizabeth are in the house making upside down cake,
yeah,
right. And apparently this is just how like Gracie makes money. The lawyer had said in passing that his wife orders a ton of cake. There's no need for it. They just do it to keep her busy. It's like this thing of almost being like, if you're keeping her busy, then you're also basically saying, we know she's a predator, so we need to keep her busy so she's not going to go be a predator.
Yeah, that's that unspoken thing of, we cannot let this woman do this again, but we also don't know how to do that. So yeah, we'll just
keep her busy.
Put her focus on this.
Yes. And so she's helping her out, and then she goes, Joe had more experience than I did.
Mm-hmm.
He's like, he was with 2 other girls before we started being with
and she was only with her husband.
And she's like, and I'd only been with my husband during the time, so he had a world of experience before me. And you could tell like Elizabeth is almost stunned.
Well, and Gracie is saying it in a way that's like, you need to believe this thing I'm telling you.
Yeah. And it's like it's stunned because it's like a lot of times, even though like, yeah, Elizabeth is a horrible person, but she wants to revel in this, and she picks her fights strategically. So her making like the daughter upset, that's fine. Teenagers have like upsets all the time, and they're not going to talk about like what is upsetting them, because it's like then they would actually confront us to what's happening with their parents. She's very careful around Gracie. And then Gracie is there making it seem like she's so sweet and innocent. Like, oh, her brothers loved and protected her. And like her younger brother would push boys against the wall if they ever came near her to ask what the intention was.
Yeah.
It's like she is this.
But then they reveal something was it the lawyer reveals about her brothers?
It's the son, but it turns out to be a lie.
Yeah. But like that's a story that Gracie has told, once again, to position herself as, I was just the poor victim in every situation I've ever been in. You have to feel sorry for me.
Yeah, and it's like this thing of it being like, and then you compare it to Joe, who has hobbies of like, helping grow like the monarch butterfly stuff. He's got these interests. He has friends. He's kind of flirting with someone online, but not really flirting.
Who's into the monarch community.
Yes, but it's also someone who's closer to his age. And
and I felt like the scene where he like lets the butterfly go was so heartbreaking, because it's the metaphor for him. He's trapped in this house with Gracie. He doesn't have the emotional maturity. He's the caterpillar. He can't form his cocoon. He can't mature into who he's supposed to be, while his children are.
Yeah.
And he's trapped.
And it's sad because it's like he gets called in by his daughter who's dressed up for her graduation, and they're all ready to go.
Yeah.
And it's like, but I think the heartbreaking bits are, we watch also between scenes, Gracie just sobbing and crying, and this is the way that she keeps Joe
manipulative hissy fits.
Yes, and it's like she's crying like a little girl.
Yeah, she's also not emotionally mature, but with her emotional immaturity, she's also a very cunning predator.
Yes.
And that's a very dangerous combination.
It's a way to keep Joe at her side, because at some point Elizabeth tells Joe she can take care of herself. She's fine. And he's like, you don't know that. You don't know her the way I know her. And that's also like that thing of manipulation, of being like, when we've heard people who, for example, can't break up with their significant others because the significant other has said they will kill themselves if they do that.
They've tricked you into thinking they're dependent on you.
Yeah, it's in reality, if you left, yes, there would be an emotional outburst, but they would get over it over time.
It's a parasitic relationship.
Yeah, and like it's when Joe confronts Gracie about it, it is heartbreaking because he's asking legitimate questions to her,
and she won't answer.
She is underlining his words, being like, "You said this." And it's also like
there's just so much cruelty in that scene.
And like manipulation even at the beginning, when like, for example, Elizabeth is having dinner, like lunch or dinner with them, and started asking at what age did they really start, and she says, was it 6th grade? And they both respond, it was 7th grade. So it is something that it seems like they have practiced this, they have decided this.
Well, they like the real life fucked up story. They've probably had media training because they were interviewed so many times.
It's also making sure they had their story straight in order not to like mix up the other. And it's like, oh, I always knew that Joe was around because he was one of the few, like there's not many Korean families. He corrects her and says half Korean. Like it's this absent of like Joe's mother because she died when he was in his 20s.
His father seems like checked out.
Is like just...
He sits in his house and kind of rots away.
And it's just like, and it's the sadness of like seeing this, and like this is probably, he's probably a good father, a good provider, a good person, but his upstart was so fucked up.
He should have never been put in this position, because he'll never be the kind of father he could be. He'll never be the kind of partner he could be. He'll never be the kind of anything he could be, because he had life stolen from him by a predator.
Yeah, and it becomes even more evident like later on in the scenes when he's being seduced by Elizabeth, where she is making like it is heartbreaking because she's making it worse by being like, you were so young, that shouldn't have happened to you. And then the moment that he kind of he's essentially having like a tantrum that would be equivalent to a teenager.
Yeah.
When he's like, I thought you liked me. I thought like this was a real thing. He's like, why did we have sex? And she just tells him, because that's what adults do.
Yeah.
And that is the moment that you see that he breaks.
He didn't think of himself as an adult.
Yeah.
He sees himself as the child that he was back when all of this happened.
And like, so that makes it heartbreaking in so many levels because you're probably like afterwards, he's sort of like on the sidelines watching his children graduate, having like an emotional reaction. So you start to wonder, did he even attend his own graduation?
I don't think he did. He couldn't
not
have.
attend because it was like this whole thing that like, you know, media would have been upon them immediately about it. And like he had to keep himself hidden and like, and he has this job that's an x-ray. So he's like in the shadows.
Yeah.
So he is.
Well, and like he's looking inside other people, terrified to look inside himself.
Yeah.
And like really come to terms with what happened to him.
Yeah. And it's like, it's also like the sad thing because you realize, oh, he has this love for insects and animals. And that's why he went to the pet store because he had that interest.
And and Gracie exploited that.
Yeah. And it's just sort of like, and this question of it being that even though like, okay, she preyed upon this one person and she marries them and they have this life together. And it's so heartbreaking because at what point do you ever question yourself like, oh man, like he could have had a better life had this not happened? Like even if say like they had met when he was 20 and she was maybe like a few years older,
like early 40s or something.
Yeah. But there's so much that he has missed out in opportunities, and that because of that, it makes you wonder, like you feel sad for the kids because the kids are basically having normal combative conversations with their parents. Like that whole thing, like how like Gracie's like super fucking mean to her, like her daughter. She's like saying, "Oh, you're so brave to show your arms."
Oh, is that the twin? Yeah, Mary.
She's like, you're so brave to show your arms. I would have never done that at your age.
But what I find interesting is Honor, who's the older one, who I get the sense has already graduated college.
No, she's in college.
So I think it feels like she's near the end of college based on the timeline of events. So she's probably like 2021.
Yeah.
She feels like it feels like there's a lot to that character that's implied and unspoken in the movie.
Like the way that she was like, they're like, oh, you know, Honor, you're gonna go see like the neck, like this gift that we got your sister, and she's like, did you get her a scale? Like you got me a scale?
Yeah. There's a lot of like, I think Honor has sized up her mother and doesn't respect her, but exists in this family because that's kind of what she has to do.
But it's also the question of it being like, if you're that combative with your parent, because she does ask, oh, what's going on with the actress? And her sister like rolls her eyes, not wanting to talk about it. And they're laughing to each other. But you almost wonder, like, was that ever brought up to the table? Has Honor ever gone like, well, if we're going to talk about fucked up things, let's talk about how you two came together. Because it's like, it's this interesting thing. The movie is based in 2015. So the internet does exist. It's not as if you can fade this out. Gracie talks about how they sold their wedding photos in order to like buy, I think it was probably buy the house or whatever. And it's like, so not only do you not want it being brought up, but when you do bring it up, there is a cash fee. Yeah,
it's the way she's turned this horror into like a money machine.
Yeah, and to show
which is even worse.
It's fine because we ended up together and it's a fairy tale, right? We went through all these obstacles to show that we're really in love. And so it's a great film, but there's so much to talk about. There's so many layers.
And it's available now on Netflix. So if you have Netflix, there's no reason not to watch it. It's there. It comes in at a little under 2 hours. So it's in that like perfect runtime that it never overstays its welcome. I feel like there was never any lull in the film. Every scene felt like it built on what was going on. The lighting and the cinematography is fantastic.
It's great. That's why when we talk about like if there's a cheapness about it, it is so well done. Because I remember like there was one scene that they're just like we're just watching like the curvature of like an arc of trees. And all I can think is, God fucking damn it, it's so well done.
Yeah.
Like,
So would you recommend this film to our audience?
yes.
Yeah, I would recommend it as well. It's available on Netflix, and you should check it out when you get the chance. A curmudgeonly instructor at a New England prep school remains on campus during Christmas break to babysit a handful of students with nowhere to go. He soon forms an unlikely bond with a brainy but damaged troublemaker and with the school's head cook, a woman who just lost a son in the Vietnam War. This is director Alexander Payne's latest film, The Holdovers. So before we talk specifically about this movie, kind of like with Todd Haynes, let's talk about Alexander Payne, because we watched all of his movies last year, I believe. Everything from Citizen Ruth up to Downsizing, which includes like Election, About Schmidt, Sideways, Nebraska, all these movies. What was your takeaway from that film series, Ariana, about Alexander Payne?
All his best films were probably before his divorce with Sandra Oh.
Yeah.
Which indicates to me either she had a great fucking influence or something broke inside.
I was gonna say she broke that man.
Because when you think about Election, when you think about Sideways,
Well, I think he's only had 2 movies since. Was Nebraska after he divorced her?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Starting with Nebraska, because there was a big gap between Sideways and Nebraska.
Yeah.
And I don't think there was anything in between.
Yeah, it's sort of like you have interesting women in the films, which when you watch
The Descendants.
The Descendants,
Which I remember kind of liking when I saw it the first time, but then when we rewatched it for that series, I hated it. The one with George Clooney in Hawaii. I think that was Sandra Oh was that.
Was that year?
I think around that time.
Sandra Oh, please answer.
Yeah. So
what did you do to this man?
I would say of all his movies, Sideways, I think is my favorite one.
Yeah, I think I like Election.
Okay.
Just because it's this interesting thing of thinking about how the audience would flip on the characters compared to then and now.
Well, the way it was received originally with Election was that the Reese Witherspoon character, Tracy Flick, was this irredeemable bitch and you should hate her. But now as an adult, I watch it and I go, no, Matthew Broderick is a piece of shit. Fuck him.
Yeah, exactly. So I have weird feelings about him. And this film did not help.
I think he's a very talented filmmaker. I think every film he makes is his thing. Like he has a certain style to it that he brings to it. And so if it's better than a lot of like, the sort of Marvel cinematic filmmakers where they get some director who has a distinct style or is emerging and then just make them do the most generic, boring shit, right? Like Alexander Payne, it's a sort of Midwestern muted kind of style.
Yeah.
And it is unique to American cinema. There isn't a lot like that.
Yeah.
You have like the Coen brothers have this kind of zany, slapstick, farcical style. You have P.T. Anderson, who often his movies have this very kind of like California sunbaked style. Alexander Payne is this kind of desolate Midwestern kind of thing is the vibe that you get.
Yeah.
And while this movie takes place on the East Coast, it still has that kind of like quiet tone to it. And like there's a lot of people saying the phrase, they're like, this is another one of those, they used to make movies like this, but they don't anymore kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I'm like, it is true. But I do agree with you that I think ultimately for me, The Holdovers did not make it to my favorite films of the year list because of some of the flaws that we're going to be talking about.
Mind you, we had an argument about it. It wasn't a big argument, but it was an argument about it.
You're a horrible person.
You want it. Okay, so we typically, I get it. It's your letterbox.
Well, that's why at the end of the year, you're going to have your own favorite films.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. But what happened was we watched the film. You asked me.
That would be the first step. First, you watch the movie.
And you went to go rate it. And we looked at Letterboxd and it's like at a 4.2.
It's pretty high.
Yeah. And I said 3.5 closer to a 3. It's a 3 in my heart.
And in mine, I was like 3.5 to a 4. And so we settled compromise 3.5.
Yes.
Yep.
But like there was a moment where you were like, oh no, the cinematography. And then today,
No. Okay. Your Honor, she's misrepresenting me. Let me correct the record. It was last night whenever it was pitted up against Blue Jean.
Yeah.
Which I think Blue Jean is a fine movie.
It's better than this film.
And I agreed with you. So why are you trying to turn this into a fight? I'm not going to be the
Because we
Siskel
need
to
more
your
listeners,
Ebert, okay?
How we get more listeners.
They're not going to hear that. Do I need to tag this? Like, oh, it's a knockdown, drag out fight between Ariana and Seth.
Whoever has us as like their number one Spotify.
We did find out in our Spotify rep, there are 3 people on Spotify who only listen to our podcast and nothing else. And I'm like, are you okay? This is not that great of a podcast. If you are one of these 3 people, please contact us.
Yeah, we want to know.
I mean, like, I think I know who one of them is.
Yeah.
But the other 2, I'm completely at a loss as to who that could be. Because I feel like there's people we know that we mentioned in passing, like, oh yeah, we reviewed that, and they had no idea, and they were someone that I thought might have listened to the podcast. So I'm like, oh, okay, huh?
Okay, we gotta get back to the
film. So I agreed with you ultimately that Blue Jean it was a slightly more, it was better when it came to the characters than the Holdovers.
Better acted.
Okay. So I do think Paul Giamatti in this movie is great. I think Paul Giamatti in almost everything is great, even when he gives a bad performance, like in Amazing Spider-Man 2, where he plays
he's giving his all.
Yeah, because when he played like the Russian mafia rhino, I was like, it is hilarious. And I feel like that's what he's going for. But yeah, it's just ultimately, but you might want to think twice about your precious Blue Jean, because it's leaving that list.
Okay, but
when you look at other movies that are coming out.
Let us talk about this film.
Okay.
God,
we'll talk about how Blue Jean didn't make the list when we do our year-end wrap.
Fuck you.
I think I really appreciated Payne's cinematography in the film.
Yeah.
The opening title sequence, he uses a Damien Jurado song, who's a Pacific Northwestern singer-songwriter that I really like. They used a lot of his music in the Netflix documentary Wild Wild Country. Mm-hmm. And I just like the vibe of that guy. It's this kind of like quiet, contemplative kind of stuff. And it worked.
The song about wanting to just go to sleep. Was that the song, or was that another song?
In the Holdovers?
Yeah.
It was the opening credits.
Okay. Yeah.
Where it was showing the like just life on the campus with the boys.
Okay.
And I just felt like it set the scene very well. Like they even do the opening production credits are done in an old 1970s style. The film is
the production stuff.
Yeah, because the film takes place in 1970.
Yeah.
And so there was an attempt to like, we want to make a movie that looks and feels like these old classic movies.
Yeah.
And I think they didn't nail it, but they did get very close. They did get very close to it. And so I appreciated that. I think the film's themes it's a good theme, which is it's a film about making connections in a very cold, cruel world where it's very easy to discard people.
Yeah.
Because the connection that Mr. Hunnam forms with Angus and the connection that they form with Mary, it's 3 people who are isolated finding a way to bond with someone and finding humanity in other people. And I think that's really well done. Like, that's a great idea. But I do feel that the tone of it is where it went wrong for me, and the way those performances are given. I don't think the film ever goes beyond the expectations that the audience would naturally set. And I kind of predicted what the sacrifice Giamatti's character was going to make in order to protect the student, in the first act of the movie.
Yeah.
Like, it is one of those movies where the themes of the film are kind of spelled out in the opening lecture between Mr. Hunnam and his students.
Yeah.
The dialogue is very heavy-handed, but that is also kind of a thing from these types of movies in the past, right?
Yeah.
They were not subtle in telling you what the movie was about.
I think my problem with this film is that the shifting that it has in order to be like, okay, it's gonna be, at first I was just like, all right, he's gonna bond with this one kid, right? But there's gonna be like a quirky like little family set up there between all the other kids until like all the other kids vanish mid-movie.
There are some surprises like that, how this whole cast of students that are left behind, because you think the holdovers, plural, oh, it's going to be about Mr. Hunnam and this ragtag group of kids. They leave like in the first 45 minutes of the movie.
Like that.
Why not?
I feel like there was a missed opportunity there. I think there was points of the film that felt as if they were making slide remarks, you know, gently poking, but never wanting to go all the way with it. There's this one kid like Teddy Kunst,
he's kind of the bitch of the movie.
Like, he's a bit of a bully. He's a fucking racist because at one point when like
Mary
Paul like Mary's giving them the food and like Paul's like, do you want to sit with us? And she's like looks at Teddy and it's like, no thank you.
There's an implied history because it's a boarding school that like this kid has made racial comments towards her.
And he's like, you know, she's supposed to be doing her job, blah, blah, blah. And like there's an outburst, but there's never a moment where we say, oh, that kid learned his lesson. Instead, the kid kind of just goes on a fucking skiing trip and gets a sunburn.
But I think you're missing, that is kind of part of the movie, right? Mr. Hunnam, his constant refrain is that the boys that come to this school don't understand the great privilege that they have, and in most cases aren't deserving of it, and that he believes their job as teachers are to teach them to have humility. And the end of the movie is that he fails in that effort, that the school isn't going to do that. The school is always going to protect these rich kids because their parents have money.
And the thing is, but my problem was, it's sort of like, for example, I was interested in like the Asian kid that did not go home because it was too far away.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just like, I noticed that like Angus is kind to him at one point because he like has an accident in the bed and he explains to him what he's going to do to help him out. Like, I kind of wish that there was more bonding between the kid and him, like other stuff. It was just like, no, we're going to go right to Paul and Angus because they're the most important.
What you're
ones.
arguing for is an entirely different movie.
I know that.
but I'm looking at the movie for what it is. And I understand what the intent of that scene from a screenwriter's point of view is. You're establishing something about Angus's character. He has empathy for those who are vulnerable or harmed, and that's something that Mr. Hunnam doesn't know about him yet.
Yeah.
And that's something that they learn about each other over the course of the movie. So the argument you could make is that this single Asian character in the movie existed only to serve as a way to showcase something about Angus, the white boy in the movie.
Exactly.
But the movie you're wanting would be an entirely different movie with entirely different themes.
Because god damn it, this movie was not that goddamn interesting.
And so what I'm doing is I'm looking at the movie as it is and how, keeping with the plot that they settled on, how could you have improved it, or what were the flaws with that?
Yeah, and then I also have a problem with the fact that so we have two black characters. One black character just appears out of fucking nowhere after Angus has an accident in the...
You talking about Danny? The janitor?
Yeah.
No, he doesn't appear out of nowhere. He's in like the opening. He's in the first act of the movie.
Really?
Yeah.
Like, what? Okay, replay it for me.
I just remember there was a black janitor that worked at the school. They showed him.
I just thought that maybe he was not there the whole entire time until it was.
Well, I mean, I didn't know he stayed during the winter
that
break.
Was the part that confused me, because then he shows up. He's like, okay, there was something happened in the gymnasium. He's like, there's vomit, and like they're both covering for each other. Then it turns out like he's sweet on Mary.
What my suspicion with that is, this movie's runtime is 2 hours and 13 minutes. My suspicion is the first cut of the movie probably was almost 3 hours, and so there's more with him
and them suffer because of it.
And I think that's a valid argument about Alexander Payne and how he handles race. I think the Asian boy is such a small role. There's an argument there, but I think the bigger argument is how poorly treated Mary's character is in the movie we get. Because they do emphasize her importance in the themes of the film, but what happens is the only purpose for Mary in the film is to remind us of the imminent mortality that was in place for young men being drafted to Vietnam. And that's to get us to sympathize with Angus's condition. We feel sorry for Mary, but the emphasis of the film is, oh no, I hope Angus doesn't have to go because he might die like Mary's son.
And the thing is, like, it's this bad thing that like it happens again and again in fucking like his movies, that the women are discarded at some point. It's like, no, they're just there in order to uplift the men's story so they're better people. And he does this all the fucking time. And it makes me angry because it's like,
well, I mean, it's weird because his first film, Citizen Ruth, is a very female-centered movie.
So like Divine Joy, who plays Mary, I saw her like in another show. I think it was a remake of a John Cusack movie.
High Fidelity.
Yes, she was in High Fidelity.
Did she play in the Jack Black role?
Yes.
Okay.
And she did great.
Because I've never seen her in anything. I looked up her filmography, and I'm not familiar.
It's like in Murder in the Building. Like she was a detective at some point.
Oh yeah, that's her. I didn't realize that was the same actress. Wow.
Like, she can like make her voice completely.
I think she was much more interesting in Only Murders in the Building than here.
It's like in this one, they give her so fucking little.
What's all she is she's grieving the death of her son.
Yeah, and
it's a one-note thing.
And so it's also like this weird thing that I feel like they're implying that there could have been a romance between her and Paul.
Yeah, that
like,
was weird.
He holds her hand and she's like, "No, you're sweaty," and it's like there's this whole thing that like.
But I think we might be reading into that. I think it's more that just Mr. Hunnam doesn't have any friends. And so it's simply him trying to make a connection with a friend. Because the film makes a much more overt move that he has feelings for Ms. Crane, the school, like the dean's secretary.
Yeah.
Which plays out in its own way that kind of feels kind of sitcom-y, and just like that plot line just kind of stops at a point. And I mean, it's a natural stopping point, but nothing is ever really done with it other than, I guess, maybe as the audience, we're supposed to understand, no, the actual relationship that is important to Mr. Hunnam is the friendship he's formed with Angus and Mary.
Yeah. It's this weird thing because, for example, at some point after everybody's like, Paul, you need to be nicer to them. Paul, you need to be nicer to them. Paul, you need. So he's like, okay, for Christmas, what is it that's something that would make you both happy? And Angus is like, I want to go to Boston. I want to like go ice skating. I want to do all this Christmas stuff, which is kind of weird when he brings up the ice skating because I'm like, I'm pretty sure you can ice skate there. It's fucking frozen, dude. And they go and do like hang out like in Boston. Mary goes to stay with her younger sister so we can, watch her slowly let go of her son. But there's like this weird moment when he's like, hey, are you sure you could stay at the hotel with us? And she's like, I need a break from you two. I can't stand your bickering. I didn't get that. I never got a point where we're seeing that they're like maybe talking and they're like following her to every room kind of thing. Cause it's like,
well, there's no build up to that.
Yeah. There's no build up that explains why Mary is like, I need to fucking get
and what that kind of does is it allows them to kind of push her to the edge of the movie. And we get like a montage kind of, and that's it.
She's like, oh, she's with other Black people hanging out.
And that's where her arc gets resolved, is like barely any dialogue. She's giving her son's baby clothes to her little sister who's pregnant, and then they're like laughing together, and that's like, oh, Mary's had her arc.
Yeah, and it's like this thing of it being okay, so now Angus and Paul are going to like hang out. And here's the thing, there are a few times where their chemistry really shines, like that you feel it's authentic, and then other times it's just not that good.
And I feel like that's more Dominic Sessa, because this is his like first official film or television acting credit, and he is 21, I believe, and he is not anywhere close to the level that Paul Giamatti is. Yeah, and we'll talk about the role of Mr. Hunnam, but let's kind of focus on Sessa and his performance as Angus. There was something you brought up about the physicality of his performance.
Yeah, I noticed like it was when they had the far shots.
It's like a wide shot.
A wide shot, either when he was waist up, he was doing a lot of physical stuff that I was like, that's a teenage boy. He would like slouch, he would like move his arms sort of like a lanky fashion that you were just like, oh, now he feels like a teenager.
It was that discomfort in your body.
Yes. Yeah. And he did it so well that it made me almost upset that they didn't take advantage of those shots to display that in a better manner. it was always up close, so he doesn't feel as comfortable with the camera to show certain emotions. There's like a few times he grimaces and he's just like, but it's this weird thing, like he's kind of like unshaven. So because he's unshaven, he kind of looks a little bit older than the rest of the kids. And then there's also like this whole thing of him being like, well, I moved so many schools that
he's been
like,
held back like a year.
He's been held back by a year. And I felt like that was almost put into the film because they're just like, maybe like he was more baby face when they cast him, and then like shit happened and they're like, oh, now he looks like a man.
Well, I also think that physicality you're talking about speaks to me of he's probably in high school, and I think he's at Carnegie Mellon as a drama student.
Yeah.
A lot of time on stage performing where you have to do bigger gestures.
Yes.
To communicate your performance to the audience. But because it's a film, Alexander Payne's doing a lot of tight shots on faces or medium shots. And yeah, he just doesn't have the presence in those shots to me, the way that like Paul Giamatti has a presence in those shots.
Yeah.
And Paul Giamatti has such an interesting face that you're always interested to watch him perform.
Yeah, I think it's also, there was not, if it's supposed to be a comedy, the reaction towards like Paul when he would give out like this historical information was not as funny as they thought it was. So like he goes to the party with Miss Crane and he's giving her all this info and she's kind of like, oh, okay, interesting. And that's when we cut to, turns out she's with someone else.
His expertise is like the ancient world, particularly like Romans.
Like it's ancient civilization, it's this whole thing. And then they go, it's not bowling, it's another version of bowling.
Pin.
Yeah. And he is talking to these people, like these two guys, one's dressed as Santa Claus, the other is like, and he's just interrupts their conversation to tell him these facts about it.
It feels very neurodivergent.
And it just feels like they're just staring him down.
And like that silence, that beat is meant to be the laughing moment.
Yeah.
But I didn't laugh.
And I didn't laugh. I didn't find it funny. Like
where I did laugh were moments when I would be surprised.
Yeah.
Like Angus being left behind and all the boys leaving. Or in the gym when Angus goes for the vault.
Yes.
And doesn't do well on it. That I thought, I genuinely laughed because it was a moment of surprise that took the movie in a direction you didn't expect.
When he starts screaming.
Yeah. But let's talk about Giamatti's character Hunnam, because I would say there's a lot of emphasis on Angus simply because that actor is that actor and character in the movie to try to get a younger audience in.
Yeah.
But it's Giamatti is like the backbone of the movie. Because if you took him out of it and it's just Angus, Mary, and some other actor as Mr. Hunnam, it just doesn't work.
Yeah.
And this is Giamatti's first collaboration with Payne since Sideways.
Yes.
So inevitably for me, I'm making comparisons because they're two very similar characters. They're both curmudgeons. They both don't have a lot of like close friendships, though his character in Sideways has at least one friendship, but even then it's a very like minefield. Yeah. And I think one of the things that I noted was Sideways is a better role for Giamatti because in that he plays a character who's aware of his flaws and wrestling with them. Mr. Hunnam is oblivious to his flaws until they're like he at least feigns that he's oblivious to them, or he's compartmentalized them in a way that he's not directly dealing with them in the way that the Sideways character was. Yeah. The whole film of Sideways is about his character coming to terms with the way he can't get over his divorce from his wife, the way he's procrastinating on his book out of a fear of failure, the way he sees himself as a failure for like the teaching job that he has. In this movie, Mr. Hunnam is like perfectly satisfied with his life.
Yeah.
And so there's not like a hook. Like there's not a hook there as to following this character as he transforms. His transformation just kind of like magically happens because he has a couple conversations with Angus.
I think it's also it feels dead in the water, especially like towards the end, because you don't feel excited as to what he's going to go into next. It's not like in Sideways, it's like, oh, he comes to terms with himself. He decides, I'm going to go fucking finish that book and I'm going to send it to so-and-so so they can tell me if they like it or not.
And this character also has a book that he's not writing to.
He's just sort of like, he gets a notebook from Mary and he's like, oh, I don't really know where I'm going to go. Maybe I'll go finish my thing. But he's not he doesn't sound enthusiastic about it.
He doesn't feel like he's come to the sort of epiphany that his character in Sideways did.
And there's supposed to be and it was a little bit touching when he him and Angus meet for the last time.
Yeah.
He's like, I don't know what you told them. I know I'm not going to military school, so thank you. And
that is a great scene.
Yeah, and he's just like, you can do this. He's like, I know this seems hard, but you can do it, in a fatherly manner that feels authentic. But then you also feel like you don't know where he's going. So is he saying it out loud to convince himself that he can do it?
But maybe that's part of the film. I don't think it works though, because I just don't feel that the Holdovers has the weight of pathos that Sideways had. And
it needed an additional scene.
I heard somebody say that the interactions in the Holdovers come off a lot of times as cartoonish.
Yeah.
And that's the vibe I got. This feels like it's not as dumb as a sitcom, but maybe it's a higher quality family drama,
yes,
like the Parenthood show or something, where it's yeah, it's okay, but it's not, it doesn't feel like any interesting ideas about the human condition are touched upon that you haven't seen in a million other movies or TV shows. And that's where I'm saying the expectations you have for this movie is going to meet those expectations, and it is not going to exceed them at all.
No.
And that's what made me really sad. Was I was hoping that we got away from the more heightened reality of downsizing.
Yeah.
And we were coming back to a more grounded reality. And we, with a stylistic shift to this 1970s aesthetic, I was on board for that. But then ultimately it feels, and I don't know if this is a trend in Hollywood, it feels like it's a trend in Hollywood where movies are being written in a way that they're over-explicating the themes, meaning that they're stating the themes in a more direct way rather than letting you as an audience member discover the themes through the characters' actions, which is the way, in my opinion, that's the way cinema should operate. But the way this comes across is I have this serious worry about American cinema, that it's being way too influenced by tropes that came from sitcoms and Disney Channel shows. And there is a logic to that because those children are now young adults and starting their own families, right? They're going to be in their mid-20s, early 30s.
Yeah.
And they have been exposed to a certain type of media. And I can see corporations just going, whoa, they like that tone. That's what the tone's going to be. Or the way the Marvel movies are so basic and childish in the way they present things. And it makes me very worried when I see critically acclaimed films coming out that tonally match that to some extent. This isn't as bad as a Marvel movie. It has, like we were saying, there's great scenes in it, but it doesn't leave me feeling as emotionally moved as I wanted the film to make me. Mm-hmm. And I think that has to do with the lack of maturity in the storytelling.
Yeah, I think it's this weird thing because with Angus, they do pull and tug on this line of it just being it's kind of confusing because I didn't know that, for example, he was considered a bad kid until I was told.
Yeah, it's not very communicated very well.
And it just sounded more like he was a pompous kid who just
all the boys we see early on are just pieces of shit.
Yeah, and so it's and I don't know if it's supposed to be we're viewing him through Paul's eyes, but it's also sort of then wouldn't he have known that this was a troublemaker? If you got a kid as a teacher who got kicked out of so many schools, you probably would have been informed that, hey, that kid has been kicked out, so we're giving him a second chance or blah, blah, blah. It's supposed to be oh no, Paul's even surprised to find out.
I could see the character of Paul Hunnam is one that just isn't going to look at these kids' files anyway.
Yeah.
He's just going to teach his class and that's all that matters.
But it's just but we're all we know Paul, Paul's character is so solid, right? But it's supposed to be we bend and and we kind of wiggle a little bit for him to change. But with Angus, it's sort of it's hard to know if this change has been embedded in him because there's so many times that he is kind of acting like a child, as he should have. But I feel there might have been more moments of if I were at his age crying, Like, he doesn't want to leave Miss Crane's party because Denise Elise is there and they're flirting.
That I did not like. That scene felt like it went nowhere.
Yeah, and then like this whole thing that when they do the 10 pins thing, he's like making eyes with another girl, and so like he leaves Paul at the movie theater because he, like, at first we're thinking, oh, he's gonna go hook up with that girl, and it turns out like no, he went to go visit like his father. And it should have been, that scene should have come with more emotion.
Yes.
And there should have been a follow, like when he's explaining to Paul what had happened between his mom and his dad, there should have been more crying and more upset, and Paul like comforting him, telling him like it's okay to cry. Instead, he's more like stoic. So the moment that, for example, that Paul is confronted by Angus's parents as to what he did, which does feel like it's a big deal because the way that she's explaining it, she's like,
I did like that you have empathy for Paul's mother. She's not a one-dimensional villain. You're like, oh yeah, by doing what they did, it did create a lot of problems.
Yeah, like if we had more emotion during that, and also emotion from him being like, maybe for a second being like, I didn't know, like that was like that he was making demands to go home and that it turned violent. Like it's just so
it just plays out the way it would in like a TV show.
And so
it's not very interesting.
It's like this weird thing that like the argument should have been maybe like even a little bit more bigger, because it, like, I think the actress did a great job, especially the dialogue of her being like, you had no right, this was a family matter, and he's like, but you weren't answering the phone. Like there should have been more
of a conflict between the two of them.
Yes, versus
it just gets kind of resolved.
It's done, and it's like Mary suddenly appears from the cafeteria because Miss Crane calls her so she can hold Angus's hand, and that's it. And so it felt like that, it was like, oh, so he made this huge sacrifice.
The sacrifice doesn't feel like it has the emotional weight that it should, other than that one last scene between Angus and Hunnam.
And it lasts for so little, and you're not excited for what Paul's going to do in the future. So you like, there should have been maybe an additional scene as to what happens to them, but the movie was already so fucking long.
Yeah, I would say it's available. I think you can rent it on all the various streaming services at the moment. If you are someone who's a big Alexander Payne fan, or you've watched all of his movies, I would say go ahead and watch it. I don't think it's a waste of your time. I just don't think it's quite as good as I'm hearing a lot of people rave about it. Mm-hmm. But then again, different people are going to react to it differently. So maybe someone listening will find it to be an incredibly enjoying film. But I think for us, it will not be one of our top films of the year. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Pop Cult Podcast. Make sure to check out our show notes for relevant links, including a link to our blog, popcult.blog. Make sure you also subscribe wherever it is you listen to podcasts so that you'll be notified as every new episode comes up. If you visit popcult.blog right now, we'll be starting here in the next few days for December a series I titled A Different Kind of Christmas. So in previous years, we've looked at more traditional Christmas movies and specials. Now I want us to kind of go off the beaten path, and that includes looking at Satoshi Kon's Tokyo Godfathers, looking at some work by Tim and Eric, looking at the British comedic character Alan Partridge, looking at some things by the Muppets, and more. In the second half of December, we will be doing our favorites of the year list, and also trying to catch up and watch as many of these great films that are coming out here at the very end of the year. If you enjoy what we do on the podcast and on the website, please think about supporting us on Patreon. We have lots of different tiers to pick from, and I'd like to thank our current patrons, Becca and Matt, who donate at the Writers Room level. You donate at that level or higher, and you'll get to pick a movie every month for us to watch and review. No matter what level you donate at, you will get access to our patron-exclusive podcasts. These are more kind of experimental ideas for series we like to try out in limited runs. Right now, we're currently in a series called Screenplay, where Ariana and I are doing a GM-less co-op role-playing game where we've kind of created our setting, story, and characters from scratch, are playing through that. We just dropped the 4th episode yesterday as of this recording, and so we hope that you subscribe so you can check those out. Well, until next time, you keep listening and we'll keep watching.